Hello, friends. How are you doing this evening? Glad you're taking the time to join me. Just kind of a surprise Monday evening live. Glad you're joining us. Be sure to hit the like button. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. Be sure to tweet this out. Make it a bigger conversation. The more people here to watch us, the better, right? I like to do these surprise lives every so often. It's Monday evening. I must say, it is an awful day today in New York City in terms of weather. Rainy, and absolutely miserable. One of those days in which you are tired because it is so darn rainy. Today, I'm glad that this evening, before I left Manhattan, I did drag myself to the gym. And I did force myself to exercise for a little bit. It certainly got my energy levels up. Oh, awful weather today. The weather was just one big, long rainy day. But now it's evening time. I'm sitting here in my Brooklyn apartment, and I wanted to talk to you all, have a little chat with you all before I head to bed for tonight. Just kind of chat with you all. First things first, if you haven't taken a listen to my conversation with Angie Speaks and Peter Coffin and the rest of the gang at Low Society Podcast. Check it out. It's now available. They're already getting a huge amount of hate from the usual suspects for having me on, but they're very happy to have had me on. I had a great time on Low Society Podcast talking Marxism, talking class struggle, talking Kamala Harris, talking Mike Pence, talking CIA manipulation of leftist politics on Low Society Podcast. It was a lot of fun. Shout out to Peter Coffin. Shout out to Angie Speaks. Shout out to everyone who was involved. It was really a lot of fun to go on that podcast and check it out. I think it was great. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that, but I also want to remind you all of something very, very, very important that's happening this Saturday. This Saturday at 7 p.m., we will be having a Center for Political Innovation web conference. We've never done this before, but streaming live on this channel, there will be a web conference for the Center for Political Innovation, CPI. We will be live on this channel. The link is below. Beautiful graphic poster. The name of our first web conference is The Socialist Future of America. So that's going to be really, really exciting. It's going to be really great. And join it. It'll be interactive. Ask questions. There will be a number of different speakers from different parts of the country. There will be musical performers. There's a kid who's a saxophone player. He's great. There's a musician who's going to play the guitar, play some of the old Pete Seeger socialist classics. And on top of that, we'll have some good presentations about socialism. Dust James is going to be chairing it. Dust James, the Marxist-Leninist trucker, he has Anti-Imperialist America. He'll be chairing the meeting. There's going to be a lively Q&A. So bring questions. And I think it'll be the first of many, hopefully, if it goes smoothly. This will be the first of many web conferences that we have for the Center for Political Innovation as we move ahead with eventually having regular conferences, right? But it's something we can do, have web conferences. This will be our first one. It will be a little bit of an experiment, but we'll see how it goes. Alrighty, I'm already writing down super chats. Fave books on religion. Alrighty. And on that note, I just wanted to give some quick opening remarks. Before I do that, since many of you are just joining us, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. Be sure to share this, make this a bigger conversation. Don't miss the conference coming up this Saturday with the Center for Political Innovation. You're going to meet some new people. You're going to love them. It's going to be very, very exciting. So on that note, I wanted to jump in to just some opening remarks here. So the big news today is that the hearings for Amy Coney Barrett, who Donald Trump has nominated for the U.S. Supreme Court, took place on Capitol Hill today. Now, folks, what's interesting about Amy Coney Barrett, one of the interesting things about her, is that she is from Indiana. And who else is from Indiana? Mike Pence, the vice president. He was the governor of Indiana for a while. He was a radio host in Indiana before that. Who else is from Indiana? Pete Buttigieg. Pete Buttigieg is from Indiana. The state of Indiana is starting to rise in prominence in U.S. politics. It is not a very wealthy state right now. Lots of poverty there. At one point, Gary, Indiana, for example, was a center of the steel industry. It was a thriving, industrial center where lots of steel was made. That's ancient history. There used to be lots of manufacturing in Indianapolis and other places. A lot of those plants have closed down. Much of the state has been devastated by the opioid epidemic. A lot of lives have been taken. Deindustrialization. It is a rural Midwestern state. I grew up in Ohio, which is right next to Indiana. We used to call the people of Indiana Hoosiers, and they call themselves Hoosiers, right? It's like they take pride in being Hoosiers. It's part of their identity. I think there's an old movie, a basketball movie, if I'm not mistaken. We're about the Hoosiers basketball team or something like that. But it's the Hoosier state, right? Indiana. A lot of evangelicals in Indiana. We're now seeing, we got Pete Buttigieg. He was the mayor of South Bend, Indiana. Now he's this rock star in the Democratic Party because he ran for president. We've now got Mike Pence, the vice president of the United States. He's from Indiana. And on top of that, we now have this Supreme Court Justice nominee, Amy Coney Barrett. So why is this particular state rising in prominence? Why? I mean, it doesn't make sense, right? Kansas is not all of a sudden dominating our politics, right? Iowa, well, we've got the Iowa caucuses, but that's about it. Why is Indiana suddenly at the center of American political discourse, right? It is a Rust Belt state. It's post-industrial. It's rural. I'm not familiar with him enough to do that right now, robot persona, but thanks for asking. Why is Indiana starting to rise? Well, you'll notice that both Amy Coney Barrett and Pete Buttigieg, Rosa Luxemburg national question, got it. National question. You'll notice that both Amy Coney Barrett and Pete Buttigieg come from South Bend, Indiana. Now, South Bend, Indiana, is the home of Notre Dame University, which is probably one of the leading Roman Catholic universities in the country. And it is not simply an academic degree-granting institution. It's what you call a research campus, meaning that huge amounts, not just of teaching and students going there and getting degrees, but also huge amounts of research is conducted in Notre Dame University. Now, what does that mean? Who does this kind of research? The military, intelligence agencies, right? This is where all these kind of things go on. And it's very safe to say that Indiana is a neocon-controlled territory. Now, South Bend is much more prosperous. It's in northern Indiana, and it's almost considered to be part of the Chicago metropolitan area. South Bend is much more prosperous. Southern Indiana, not so much. Central Indiana, not so much. But northern Indiana, right, where South Bend University is, right? Pete Buttigieg is a Democrat. Most of the state is overwhelmingly Republican. Pete Buttigieg is a Democrat. South Bend, Indiana, is this kind of prosperous, what you can call a college town in the Midwest. And Pete Buttigieg was the mayor of it. Amy Coney Barrett, federal judge, lives there, is from there. And South Bend is a little more prosperous. Now, one thing that might be interesting is that the research of Alfred Kinsey, do people know Alfred Kinsey? The Kinsey Report was conducted in South Bend, Indiana. right? Alfred Kinsey, the Kinsey Report, right? One of the key academic works that laid out the sexual revolution, right? Alfred Kinsey did all kinds of research, interviewing people about their sex lives, arguing that homosexuality was more prominent, arguing that all kinds of things that were very taboo in the United States were more prominent. He published, Sexual Behavior of the Human Male, Sexual Behavior of the Human Female. His research was paid for by Rockefeller Foundations, but he did it in South Bend, Indiana. And one thing about Alfred Kinsey that is widely obscured, and people don't widely acknowledge it, it's certainly not in the movie about Alfred Kinsey with Liam Neeson, is that Alfred Kinsey actually utilized pedophiles in his research. You can Google this, read about Alfred Kinsey, working out of South Bend, Indiana. He conducted this research into human sexuality, and he found at least one pedophile that he worked with to conduct this research. I'm not going to get into detail. You guys can Google the details. It's particularly disgusting. That's a little secret of South Bend, Indiana, that many people are not aware of. Now, another interesting detail about South Bend, Indiana, is that it is very much home to not only Pete Buttigieg, but the reason that Pete Buttigieg lived there and developed big roots there, etc., is because Pete Buttigieg's father was a Marxist academic at Notre Dame University. Pete Buttigieg's father, Joseph Anthony Buttigieg, was the translator of the works of Antonio Gramsci. Right? We know who Antonio Gramsci was. He was the Italian Marxist who, when Mussolini came to power, was thrown into prison. So he wrote these essays, and because he was trying to get the essays around the prison censorship, he did not use any buzzwords. Right? He didn't use any Marxist words. He didn't talk about Marxism, didn't talk about class struggle, he didn't talk about the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. He wrote these prison notebooks that used coded language to make Marxist political points and did not talk about the Soviet Union, did not directly attack capitalism, but simply talked about the theory of praxis, simply talked about the cultural struggle. And that in the post-World War II world, long after Gramsci was dead, the academics who were influenced by Marxism but opposed the Soviet Union, folks like the Frankfurt School, very much very closely studied the writings of Antonio Gramsci. And it was actually Pete Buttigieg's father, Joseph Anthony Buttigieg, who translated Antonio Gramsci's writings into the English language, right? They were in Italian, of course, but it was his father who translated them and then started the International Gramsci Society, which was like a gathering point. That was the Frankfurt School. That was Adorno. That was all the big names, Herbert Marcuse, all the big names associated with the reinvention of Marxism in the post-World War II era, the distortion, the anti-populist distortion of Marxist politics that I talk about so much, very much came out of South Bend, Indiana. Right? It's a very important place. It is a very, very important place. But I'm talking about neocons, right? I mean, Alfred Kinsey was not a neocon. Joseph Anthony Buttigieg was certainly not a neocon. Why is it neocon territory? Well, South Bend, Indiana, in addition to being home to Notre Dame University, it is also, a center of what you can call the Catholic charismatics. Now, this is fascinating, right? The more we learn about Amy Coney Barrett, right? Mike Pence, Amy Coney Barrett, and Mike Pompeo all have a very similar life story, right? Mike Pompeo is from Kansas. Mike Pence is from Indiana. Amy Coney Barrett is from Indiana. They all grow up Roman Catholic. They all practice Roman Catholicism. But then as young people in their early 20s, they all attend charismatic religious events and more or less shed their Catholicism, right? Mike Pompeo full-on converted to being an evangelical, right? Now, Mike Pence attended in 1978 when he was a college student. He attended a an evangelical, charismatic religious festival with lots of lights and music and all of that, and had his born-again experience. But he stayed Catholic, right? And he and his wife remained Roman Catholic until 1995. From 1978 to 1995, Mike Pence tells us that he was an evangelical and a charismatic within the Catholic Church, right? And finally, in 1995, Mike Pence joined an evangelical, non-denominational fundamentalist church, right? Now, Amy Coney Barrett still maintains that she is a Roman Catholic. However, as is widely reported on, she's a member of this special, what they call a parachurch organization called People of Praise. Now, what's fascinating is, Pompeo, Pence, Amy Coney Barrett, they all in their own way seem to be influenced by Pentecostalism, right? Now, or what they call charismatic Christianity. And that is a form of Christianity that involves basically people being induced into hypnotic trances, right? If you go to a Pentecostal church service, you go to a charismatic People of Praise service, people get kind of hypnotized and they get into a hypnotic state. One thing that they're famous for is that they will become so hypnotized that they will begin babbling incoherently. They call this speaking in tongues. I actually had an uncle who was a theater professor, and in his theater classes, it was like a legend. I never saw this, but I was 9 years old when he died. But he was famous for, in his theater classes at DePaul University in Chicago, my late uncle would induce the same kind of trances in his students, and he would reveal that speaking in tongues was not magic. It wasn't God speaking through you. It was actually it was a hypnotic state. He would be giving his lecture on theatrical history, and then he would point at one of his students. He would do the whole hypnotic thing, and then he would have his students start babbling in tongues in the class, right? And he learned to do that. It is a common thing that has been done throughout history. Sorcerers and shaman have done it. It is a hypnosis technique one can do. And my late uncle, actually used to do it in his theater classes, proving that it does not have a mystical religious value. But this is, People of Praise. They get people into these hypnotic trances, and so does, of course, the Pentecostals. So do the non-denominational Christians. And it is a mind control method. People associate it with brainwashing, with hypnosis. People refer to People of Praise. A lot is coming out now. People are calling it a cult. That apparently when you join, you're assigned kind of a mentor who is of the same sex as you, that helps guides you and tells you what life decisions you're allowed to make regarding who you can marry, who you can date, what kind of jobs you can take. Very, very interesting stuff. And that while the Catholic Church is now in a very, very liberal, swing at this point. The Roman Catholic Church is, at this point, denouncing capitalism. We got Pope Francis getting friendly to China. The People of Praise community is very close to the Federalist Society. It's very close to all kinds of neoliberal free market organizations. So it's very, very interesting what's going on there. Now, I also wanted to mention, right, now, People of Praise, we do know that it is a right-wing organization that has kind of infiltrated the Catholic Church and has a lot of influence in South Bend, Indiana. But nearby South Bend, it's not in South Bend, but it's in the same part of Indiana, in northern Indiana, there's an institution called the Hammond Baptist Church. I don't know if people are familiar with the Hammond Baptist Church. It was, in the 1980s, considered to be the biggest church in the entire world. It was led by Minister Jack Hyles, who was the founder of the Independent Baptist movement. And on Sundays, they would have 3 services at the Hammond Baptist Church in the 1980s, and there would be 20,000 people at each service. 20,000 people, 20,000, 3 times. They'd have 60,000 people in this church every Sunday. That's how big of an institution it was. And the reason it was so big, the reason Hammond Baptist Church was so big and remains so big, it's a very large church still, is because they pioneered something called bus ministry. And what would happen is that Jack Hyles would send his congregation throughout the metropolitan Chicago area, throughout northern Indiana, and knock on the doors of low-income people. Just knock on their doors and say, hey, we're going to have church on Sunday morning. We have a big bus. Can we pick you up? And that's how they would get people in the pews. They had buses. And the whole, dedicated members of the church would go around door to door in low income working class neighborhoods, knock on the door, knock on the door, and say, hey, can we pick you up on Sunday morning? And if you watch Jack Hyles' sermons, Jack Hyles is a very, very effective orator. Was a very, very effective orator. He's always pushing this concept of quote unquote soul winning, right? That his members were required to go knock on people's doors, knock on people's doors. They were required to do that. And then they would connect you to this bus ministry where they would pick you up. And so in a lot of cases, there were many cases where the parents would not go to the church, right? It would be low income parents, and they'd say, the knock on the door, they'd say, well, take my kids to the church. I'm going to stay home and watch football or whatever, right? And that was very common too. So there are a lot of kids who would end up going to Hammond Baptist Church and getting indoctrinated, whereas the parents would have no idea what was going on. And it was huge. I mean, Hammond Baptist Church was huge, and they were neocons. They were absolutely neocons. I mean, you read about them. They were all about, hating communists. They were all about hating draft dodging people who didn't fight in Vietnam. They were all about hating what do they call it? Draft resistors. They were all about hating gay people, very, very, very hateful toward gay people. Almost every sermon Jack Hyles has some kind of nasty joke about the AIDS crisis and how he's kind of happy that gay people are dying. Really vile right-wing kind of stuff. And there's what's even more interesting though is that Hammond Baptist Church is tied to the CIA. Right? During the 1980s, Hammond Baptist Church was very heavily involved in the civil war in Nicaragua, right? That they were raising money for the Contras. They had a church in Nicaragua, like an affiliate of the Hammond Baptist Church in Nicaragua. I think they still do. And they even provided education. If you were a Contra fighter in Nicaragua, your kids could move to the United States and get a visa somehow and go to their fundamentalist high school and education. So, and if you watch the funeral, the memorial service, the memorial, or there's a video of the death of Reverend Jack Hyles. There is a line of like elementary school aged kids who are putting flowers on his coffin. Almost all of the kids are Latino. Right? They're all indigenous, dark-skinned indigenous kids from Central America, from Guatemala, from Nicaragua, from El Salvador, because Hammond Baptist Church was heavily, heavily, heavily involved in the efforts, in the CIA's efforts to fight against the Sandinistas and fight against the FMLN in El Salvador. So it's fascinating stuff. Now, what's wild about Hammond Baptist Church in Indiana is that they were brought down by a child molestation scandal. Now, apparently, in this bus ministry, there was an individual who was a child molester, and he, the kids would get on the bus and he would touch them inappropriately. It's alleged that the church covered this up and kind of protected this individual. Furthermore, Jack Hyles' son-in-law was involved in a sex scandal as well. Jack Hyles' daughter, Linda Hyles Murphy, she has kind of come out against the Hammond Baptist Church and described how Jack Hyles was a personal millionaire, and how he would pick out women from the church to be his mistresses, and he would buy off their husbands. He would find women in the church that he found to be attractive, and he would go to their husbands and say, "Here's $20,000. I'm going to start coming over to your house and sleeping with your wife." He was quite a I don't know what you want to call it. He was quite a sexual predator. Is that the right word for it? I don't know. He was not good. Jack Hyles was not a good guy. But he built this church that was like a huge institution. But after the fall of the Soviet Union in the 90s, all of a sudden, all the sex scandals started coming out like crazy, and they were kind of under attack. But they were very much a CIA-linked institution. But you have to remember, okay, the CIA is all over the United States. The CIA is all over the world. There are different wings within the U.S. CIA. right? There is an individual who I've talked about before who was the spiritual advisor to Al Gore. Her name is Marilyn Ferguson, and she was based in Southern California, right? And she wrote this book called The Aquarian Conspiracy. And the book is endorsed by all kinds of people that are linked to the CIA, like Carl Rogers, the psychologist, like Arthur Kessler, the German anti-communist propagandist. That wing of the CIA was based in Southern California. That's like the more liberal wing of the CIA, right? And, those are the folks that pushed Silicon Valley, right? We know Silicon Valley and the computer revolution would not have happened without the CIA. They realized the Soviet Union could not afford to spend enough money to advance computer technology, so they arranged for, Microsoft and Google and all of them to get going. I mean, the CIA arranged for Southern California to be the center of the computer revolution because the market wasn't going to do it. They needed, it was kind of, the think tanks of the CIA that determined that the computer revolution would give the United States an edge over the Soviet Union. They determined this in the 70s and 80s, and that was very much the CIA's work. If you read Marilyn Ferguson's book, The Aquarian Conspiracy, which is this bizarre occult screed, Malthusian, it's a bizarre text. It's very much a synthetic left manifesto, The Aquarian Conspiracy. At the end of the book, she talks about, America is free, she says, but California is freer. And she lists like 7 think tanks in California, all of which are proven to be CIA think tanks, right? And it's been revealed that, Marilyn Ferguson, she claimed to have psychic powers and be a medium. Well, it's been revealed that these very think tanks she names were being contracted by the CIA to do psychic research. I kid you not, to hire psychics and do experiments with LSD and all that. That's the liberal wing of the CIA. The liberal wing of the CIA is in Southern California. However, there's another wing to the CIA, and this is the important point here, right? This is the important point, right? Right? Who was director of the CIA for many years? George Herbert Walker Bush, right? He was CIA director. He eventually became vice president under Reagan, and then he became president. And then his son, George W. Bush, was also president for 8 years. Those folks, Mike Pompeo, Gina Haspel, the Bush family, they represent a very different wing of the CIA than Marilyn Ferguson, okay? And that there are big differences within the U.S. deep state and intelligence apparatus, right? Now, for example, right, we know John Brennan, who was the CIA director under Barack Obama. John Brennan admits that in 1976, he was a young man. He voted for the Communist Party USA in the 1976 presidential election because he wanted to rebel against the system. He was young and naive. He says he voted communist in the presidential election in 1976. John Brennan was CIA director under Obama. He says that if Obama ever asked him to torture, he would step down because America does not torture. He does not believe in torture. Now, John Brennan was the CIA director of CIA operations in Saudi Arabia for many years. He was in Riyadh, in the Saudi capital, for 10 years. He lived in Riyadh, in the Saudi capital. And when Obama selected John Brennan to be his CIA director, a number of people came forward alleging that John Brennan had converted to Islam while he was in Saudi Arabia. Now, none of that's been proven. There's really no way to confirm that, right? I mean, John Brennan never made any statements about his religion. Some people alleged that he wanted to bring a CIA team into the city of Mecca, and that in order to get into Mecca under the laws of Saudi Arabia, you must be a Muslim. So he and 4 CIA guys, they took an oath, or they went through the motions. They became symbolically Muslims to get into Mecca. That's one rumor. The other rumor, though, is that because Obama and the U.S. government, have facilitated the Wahhabi kind of death squads, right, in Afghanistan, and then later during the, in Syria and in Libya, some allege that no, John Brennan is actually a for real Muslim convert. Now, this could all just be a stretch, right? They were saying Obama was a Muslim too, right? This is, you never know about any of this stuff, right? This is all just rumors. But John Brennan was not a conservative. and is not a conservative, right? I mean, that's just very clear, right? Conservatives don't vote for Gus Hall. Conservatives don't grandstand hard against torture like that. Well, John McCain did a little bit, but, I mean, conservatives don't, have, it's not alleged widely that conservatives in the United States have converted to Islam. So, John Brennan is that liberal wing of the CIA. Well, you'll remember that Donald Trump, when he came in, he appointed first Mike Pompeo was the CIA director, right? And Mike Pompeo is an evangelical. He was Roman Catholic. He converted to being an evangelical. He's from Kansas, right? And then he became Secretary of State, and he was replaced by Gina Haspel. And when Gina Haspel became CIA director, it was widely reported that she was an advocate of torture. An advocate of torture. And this is where we start to see the difference between the liberal CIA and the conservative CIA. The liberal CIA thinks it is in the interests of America, of America's image, to be known as never torturing anybody. Why? Because they don't want people around the world to think of the United States as a torturing country, right? They think it's bad for PR. Meanwhile, the conservative CIA tends to think what Donald Trump has publicly stated, which is that they believe it's good for the United States to have the reputation of torturing people, right? This is Gina Haspel. This is Mike Pompeo. This is Donald Trump very openly, that it will strike terror into the hearts of our enemies to have it be known around the world that we engage in torture. And I mean, we know, right, it's been widely discussed. During the Bush years, there was the Abu Ghraib scandal. Torture doesn't work. It's not a good way to get information. It's really not a good way to get information. If you're torturing somebody, they will tell you whatever you want to hear, right? You tortured them. They stop torturing me. I'll tell you whatever you want to hear. That's how it works. The purpose of torture is never is the purpose of torture to gain information. The purpose of torture is to terrorize people. And to have it be known among your enemies and among your domestic population that this is something that could happen, right? And, the idea is that, okay, sure, right? These people want to be martyrs. They're trained to be martyrs or whatever. But nobody, they think, oh, I'll die, I'll go straight to heaven. Well, we're going to torture you a whole bunch before you die, right? The other thing is that torture has weird psychological value. They talk about Stockholm syndrome, right? That when you start to torture people, right, they start to lose their mind. And you can actually recruit people by torturing them, as bizarre and insane as that sounds, right? That if you subject people to torture for a long enough time, right? They're locked in a room, they're only seeing you, and you're torturing them and talking to them. You become their only companion, and you eventually will convert to your torturer's belief system, right? So torture is it's a way of brainwashing someone and recruiting them to work for you. And it's also just a mechanism of terror. So the Gina Haspel, Mike Pompeo, Donald Trump, George Bush, conservative wing of the CIA wants the United States not only to torture, but to be known as engaging in torture. The John Brennan, Marilyn Ferguson, liberal CIA wants the United States to be known as this happy, fun country that never tortures nobody. And I mean, at the end of the day, right? I mean, is it possible that they've been torturing people all along and they just, I'm not saying the liberal CIA doesn't do it. I'm saying they want the United States to be known as not doing it. Yes, the first personal computer was invented in the Soviet Union. Absolutely right. We'll talk about Soviet computers. I'll revisit that in the Q&A. So at this point, right, you got these two wings of the CIA, and decolonization, writing it down. So you got two wings of the CIA, the liberal wing and the conservative wing. And it seems very much like Indiana is the headquarters of the conservative wing of the CIA. Very much so. It is the neocon wing of the CIA, the folks that are in with People of Praise, with Hammond Baptist Church. That's the folks that are doing research at Notre Dame, and that's the folks they're connected to. So how does that explain Pete Buttigieg? How does that explain Pete Buttigieg? He's a liberal, right? He's gay, right? He's the first openly gay man to run for U.S. president or something. No, actually, the first gay man to actually be on the ballot for president was the Socialist Party, David McReynolds. But the first Democrat for president who's openly gay, I think, maybe not. I don't know. So how does Pete Buttigieg fit into all of this? Well, we know Pete Buttigieg's father was this strange translator of Gramsci's writings, the founder of the International Gramsci Society. But Pete Buttigieg, as you will recall, he was mayor of South Bend, Indiana. He had just gotten elected. Then 9/11 happened, and he immediately joined the U.S. military and went off to fight in Afghanistan. Immediately. Immediately goes off to fight in Afghanistan. Um, and is he's not being mayor, right? The people of South Bend voted for him, and then he's off to Afghanistan for some military careerism. He comes back, and that dude is a hawk, and he is absolutely a hawk, right? I mean, Afghanistan comes up in every interview, for example, and he went after Bernie Sanders. How dare he praise Cuba? He compared Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders to each other. Marxist humanism. Compared Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders as both being kind of demagogic threats to the elite. And, right now in American politics, at this point, the neocons are divided. Most of the neocons at this point want Trump out because they consider him a populist. They consider him too friendly to Russia, not trustworthy on foreign policy, right? John Bolton, they want him out. George W. Bush wants Trump out, right? Members of Bush's cabinet, right? The McCain family, they all want him out. However, Mike Pompeo is in the Trump camp. Mike Pompeo is in the Trump camp, right? And, Gina Haspel appears to be in the Trump camp. I mean, we can only speculate. I don't think she's made a public statement. And Mike Pence is definitely in the Trump camp. And it appears the neocons are kind of hedging their bets. They want to control Trump because there is a side of Trump that is more isolationist and all of that. But they want to keep one foot in the door with Trump. But on the other hand, they kind of see Trump as a threat. So the neocon wing of things is kind of divided. And it's very interesting. Very, very interesting. Very, very interesting. So Indiana is starting to play a central role because Indiana is a stronghold of the neocons. That's really what it gets down to. Indiana is neocon territory. Right? Notre Dame, Indiana, it's CIA neocon territory. However, the neocons, it seems that they don't have a problem working with gay people these days. Right? They got Pete Buttigieg. It seems like there is a liberal branching out of the neocons, right? We know that. Hillary Clinton's State Department, et cetera. But the neocon wing of the CIA, they are well entrenched institutionally in Indiana. Well entrenched. Well entrenched in Indiana. That's very clear. And so now this state that is not very big is starting to have a disproportionate role in U.S. politics. Indiana, this small rural state that has been economically devastated by deindustrialization, suddenly Mike Pence, Amy Coney Barrett, Pete Buttigieg, Indiana is starting to exert its power, probably to counter California, right? Probably to counter the soft power liberal wing of the CIA and Silicon Valley. I suspect Indiana's emergence of strength is about pushing back some of the influence of the California headquarters of the CIA, which is growing more and more powerful every day. You have to remember that, right? That the Silicon Valley, California, Maryland Ferguson wing of the CIA is very, very influential nowadays with the internet. So I think that as the neocons fight for their position, we're going to see Indiana continue to rise in prominence. Amy Coney Barrett is tied to this neocon People of Praise grouping. And it's very interesting. But, I grew up not very far from Indiana, went to Indiana many a time. Very interesting development. Very interesting indeed. So, on that note, folks, names and locations. Let's do our roll call. I will call you out as I see you. Who's with us? Names and locations. I'll call you out as I see you. Who's with us? Who's with us? Who is with us? David in Italy, somewhere USA. Los Angeles, Lena. Salt Lake City, I am Sudan. Who else is with us tonight? Toronto. Daniel in Los Angeles. Vallejo, California. JG24, Springfield, Missouri. A bunch went by really fast. Xi Jinping is in Germany. Mr. Anderson is in Mississippi. Ramiro in East LA. Chandler in Georgia. Brian Schaefer in Illinois. U.S., Pennsylvania. Australia. Milton, PA. Buffalo, New York. Marissa. Ellie from California. Phoenix, Arizona. Vancouver. Right? Buenos Aires, Argentina is with us. Wow. Boogie Down, Bronx. Silas Mansfield is with us. London, UK. Belize. Cleveland, Pirate Alex. LA. Melbourne. Natalie, Springfield, Missouri. Shanghai, China. Seattle. Buenos Aires, Argentina. Very good. Very, 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 very good. Good stuff, folks. Mumbai. Denver, Colorado. Amsterdam, Joanne. St. David's, Bermuda. Very good. Very, very good. Troy in Kansas City, Missouri. Ali in Libya. George in Manhattan. Irvin in Los Angeles. Troy in Kansas City. Sun Young Moon from Seoul. Very funny. Austin from Massachusetts. Talk about liberal versus conservative CIA. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later. Baltimore, Wilmington, Delaware, Quito, Snake River, Queens, New York, Lloyd Bennett. Right? There you go. Black Site Rendition Center, Texas. Very, very good. Very, very, very good. Delaware. Delaware is with us tonight. Delaware is in the house. Any other names and locations? I will call you out as I see you, as I always do. Names and locations. Connecticut. Oh, we've got folks in Connecticut. Very good. Winnemucca. Sydney, Australia. Andre from Virginia. Andre is with us. Nate from Sydney is with us. Very, very good. Sydney, Australia. Mexico. Columbus, Ohio. Motor City, baby. SoCal. Dante from SoCal. SoCal, so red. York, Pennsylvania. Joshua Tree, California. Nassau County, New York. You know, one wild thing about New York, right, is that New York City is like the most metropolitan, cosmopolitan city in the country, right? It's New York City, right? Capital of capitalism, Wall Street, and all of that. Right outside of New York City, there is a town called Hicksville. Now, when someone said, "Well, that's a Hicksville," I always thought that was like a slur, like Hicks, like no, but it's actually the name of the place, Hicksville. That's actually what it's called, Hicksville. Outside of New York, they have Nassau County, right? And they've got Syosset. And it's like as soon as you get into upstate New York, it's like you've got the most hillbilly names ever. Hicksville, Nassau County, Syosset, right? I mean, it's like you want to. It's bizarre. It's like so. New York City is the most like cosmopolitan, urban elite that you can get, and so it's like right outside of New York, you have like the most like hillbilly. I mean, it's funny, and those places aren't really like that either. It sounds that way. The names sound like, it sounds like a county in Kentucky. Right? Nassau County is not supposed to be in New York City. It's Nassau County. It sounds like Kentucky. Hicksville sounds like a city in Kentucky. Okay? Syosset, again, sounds like Kentucky. But it's not like that, right? Long Island is not like that. Long Island actually has areas that are really posh and wealthy. Lots of Desi immigrants in Hicksville. Exactly. I mean, so it doesn't even line up that way. Right? So, but it's just kind of amusing. I think it's really kind of hilarious. But there's also parts of Long Island that are very working class as well, right? And Long Island is a long island. It's a very big island. It's very mixed, right? And there's Long Island City, Long Island University, and there's parts of Queens that are kind of like Long Island. If you read, what's the book? That famous book, the Great Gatsby. It takes place in Long Island and in Manhattan. Right? It's it's West Egg and East Egg, which are these like rich places in Long Island, and they drive through Queens into Manhattan, and they refer to Queens in the book as the Valley of Ashes. Right? It's this like industrial area. At that point, there's all these factories and smokestacks and pollution and stuff, and a lot of the novel, The Great Gatsby, it takes place in West Egg and East Egg and in Manhattan, on Wall Street, and in the Valley of Ashes. And there's this whole drama with somebody sleeping with somebody's wife and somebody shooting somebody. And you can read but it's about New York City in the 1920s, and living in this area, having been to Queens, having been to Long Island, having been to Manhattan, going to Manhattan almost every day for work. It's interesting how all of this plays out, right? Because you're seeing what you read about in the novel. And it's changed a lot. It's really changed a lot. I mean, there's still some factories in Queens, but just like in Brooklyn, there's a lot of empty industrial spaces, right? Just a lot of, the hipsters in Brooklyn, a lot of the hipster stuff. It's, former factories, old buildings where there used to be factories that turned into hipster apartment buildings or art galleries and all of that. Queens is still Queens. Anyway, folks, anyway, I have got a number of super chats to get to. If you have more super chat questions, you can always just super chat me, and I will answer them one at a time. Okay, first things first. Favorite book someone asked on religion. By far, the best book on religion is The Foundations of Christianity by Karl Kautsky. That is definitely the key text to understanding Christianity, to understanding Judaism, to understanding the Roman Empire, to understanding the Vatican and the foundations of the Catholic Church, and understanding the role of the Christian faith among Palestinians, etc. That is the book. That is the book. Karl Kautsky's The Foundations of Christianity is the book to understand the Christian religion, I think. I learned so much from that book. There are other books, but that's one I would strongly recommend is The Foundations of Christianity by Karl Kautsky. Okay, Rosa Luxemburg versus Lenin on the national question. Lenin's position on the national question was very different than most of the Marxist movement's position on the national question. Marxism rejected the concept of a nation, right? In 1848, right? That's when Karl Marx, the Communist Manifesto, was written. That's when the first, communist uprisings were happening. The Communist League was a division in the German Revolution of 1848. All across Europe, you had uprisings demanding the creation of modern nation states. They called 1848 the Spring of Nations. And there was a revolt in Germany, and there was a revolt in France, multiple revolts in France, and in Belgium, and in Hungary, and in Britain, and in all kinds of places. There were all kinds of uprisings. 1848, the Spring of Nations. And they were rising up, demanding the creation of modern nation states, right? They wanted nations, right? In fact, a lot of the revolts were they were republicans. They wanted democratic republics, but they wanted national governments. They didn't want principalities, right? In 1848, what was the song the Germans marched into battle to fight in the German Revolution with? Deutschland, Deutschland, über alles. Right, that's a song associated with Nazism now. But back then, that was the song of the German peasants, largely, rising up against their local landlord and their local aristocrat and the King of Prussia and the King of Bavaria, demanding that all the Germans be united into one nation. And Richard Wagner and Karl Marx were on the same side in that revolution. Wagner was this anti-Semitic composer, and Karl Marx was a Jewish, revolutionary and leftist, but they were on the same side, fighting for the creation of a modern German nation state, right? And the anthem of the German Revolution, what was it? It was Deutschland, Deutschland über alles, Deutschland over all the world, right? But the Marxists argued though that they did not believe in nationalities, right? Obviously, they wanted a democratic German nation state that would be better than feudalism, but Marx, he ends the Communist Manifesto with working men of all countries unite, right? And that Marxism said that there was the worker and the capitalist, that there were no national divisions between the worker and the capitalist, right? That nationalism was something invented to play workers against each other. National loyalty, national chauvinism. The working man has no country. Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains and a world, not a country, not a nation, but a world to win. And that was the Marxist view, and that was the view of Karl Kautsky, and that was the view of the Second International, and that was the view of the Marxist movement. Now, some of them took it, more seriously than others. We know, when World War I broke out, Karl Kautsky and much of the Second International, almost all of the Second International, sold out and supported their governments in World War I and supported sending 20 million workers to their deaths so the capitalists could divide up the world. However, right? Some Marxists, like Rosa Luxemburg, like Eugene Debs in the United States, like Lenin, stayed true to rejecting national chauvinism, right? And Rosa Luxemburg was famous for what she called a manifesto that she wrote against World War I that was called the Junius pamphlet. The Junius pamphlet, and it was a message to the German working class about why they should not fight in World War I, why they had nothing to gain from fighting in World War I. The Junius pamphlet, and Lenin loved the Junius pamphlet. He thought it was a brilliant pamphlet. It was brilliant, and it was circulated all over Germany. And Rosa Luxemburg went to prison for publishing this pamphlet because it was against the war, and World War I was going on, and she was disrupting the war effort. And Rosa Luxemburg spent a long time in prison for writing this Junius pamphlet, which was this pamphlet urging German workers not to fight in World War I. Rosa Luxemburg was Jewish, but she was born in Poland. However, she spent most of her revolutionary life in Germany. And Rosa Luxemburg took the general Marxist position on the national question. She said there is no nationality. There is no nation, right? There's just workers and bosses. There are no Germans. There are no Poles. We're down with national barriers. Workers. There are just workers versus bosses. Lenin really stood alone, right? You had the reformist leaders of the Second International, Kautsky, and others that just sold out, right, and just supported imperialism, right? Then you had the minority, like Eugene Debs. Eugene Debs said the working man has no country, right? Where there is a working class, an oppressed class, I'm in it. Rosa Luxemburg, they took the position workers have no country, which was the more radical position. But Lenin, his position was different even than Rosa Luxemburg and Eugene Debs and others' positions. Lenin took the position that there were two types of nationalism, that there is the nationalism of the imperialists, there's national chauvinism, right? There's the Germans wanting to take over the whole world, there's the British Empire, there's American imperialism, there's the nationalism of the French Empire, there's the nationalism of the colonizer, the national chauvinism of the imperialist, but that there is nationalism of the oppressed. And that the nationalism of the oppressed is progressive. And that the Marxists should oppose the nationalism of the imperialist and the national chauvinism of the oppressor, but embrace the nationalism of the oppressed. Now, Rosa Luxemburg vehemently disagreed with Lenin on that point. She said, you cannot divide workers according to their nationality. But Lenin said, no, workers that are oppressed, and not just workers, but even capitalists that are oppressed from oppressed nationalities should be supported in their struggle against the imperialists. The fight for national liberation, for oppressed and colonized nations, is something that Marxists should take up. That was the position of Lenin, the Bolshevik position, right? That if people in Africa fight for their independence, that they're fighting for the independence of Zimbabwe, that the capitalists and the workers of Zimbabwe should join arm in arm to resist colonization, right? That Rhodesia, the British Empire, should be smashed, and it shouldn't be, just hey, British colonizer workers and African workers. No, no, no. That there should be a struggle for national liberation, right? That is the difference between the two on the question. But to be fair, the first Congress of the Communist International opened with a moment of silence for Rosa Luxemburg. And I think that that moment of silence was very much making clear that if Rosa Luxemburg were not dead, she would have been at that opening, Congress, right? That Rosa Luxemburg was considered an ally of the Bolsheviks. Right? She was not an enemy of the Bolsheviks. She did not agree with them on this national question. She had other differences with the Bolsheviks, with Lenin, but she was considered, the Bolsheviks considered Rosa Luxemburg to be their ally. Rosa Luxemburg, World War I ended. It ended, World War I ended with a workers' revolution. The workers of Germany rose up. The German Kaiser had asked the German Navy to, commit a suicide mission after there had already been peace declared on the land at the end of World War I. The German sailors refused to do it. They shot their officers. The uprising soon spread to the army and the population at large. The government of the Kaiser was toppled, and a government of workers and soldiers' deputies was created, like a socialist, working class government, was declared. And then they went to Weimar and they wrote a constitution for the new Weimar Republic. And Rosa Luxemburg and many of the revolutionaries wanted Germany to move towards socialism. But the Social Democratic Party, Kautsky, Ebhardt, Schneiderman, they said, oh, no, can't do that. So we're just going to write a regular capitalist constitution. But if the people want to vote for communists or socialists, that's up to them. So the Social Democratic Party sold out the revolution. Rosa Luxemburg then broke with the Social Democratic Party to form what was called Spartacusbund. And she and Karl Liebknecht, they formed Spartacusbund. And Spartacusbund was this revolutionary group that led uprisings demanding socialism in Germany, right? They did not want the Weimar Constitution, the capitalist constitution. They wanted socialism. And so the Social Democrats hired the Freikorps, which were the free officers. These were right-wing soldiers who were, called free officers, to go and kill Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht and other socialist revolutionaries. And so these Freikorps were mobilized by the Social Democrats to kill Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. And not just them, but all kinds of communists and revolutionaries. And they were killed. Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, thank you for the super chat, were killed by the Freikorps. Now, who was one of the Freikorps? Adolf Hitler, right? And fascism eventually emerged out of the Freikorps movement. It was these military guys who were right-wing and hated communists, and they were paid by the Social Democrats to go and kill Rosa Luxemburg and the revolutionaries. What's interesting is it wasn't just Rosa Luxemburg. Even after Rosa Luxemburg was killed, you also had Bavaria, the German province of Bavaria, declaring independence from Germany and declaring itself to be the Bavarian Soviet Republic. And briefly, Bavaria, had a communist government, and the Freikorps and, the Social Democrats crushed the Bavarian Soviet Republic. So the immediate aftermath of World War I, in which Rosa Luxemburg was killed, was very, very dramatic. And there was a lot of hope on the part of the Bolsheviks that Germany would become, would join them. That Germany and Russia and the the Soviet Union and Germany would become one country, and that they would become one unified Soviet alliance, and that Germany and Russia would stand together. The British were desperate to make sure that doesn't happen. The greatest fear of the British is Germany and Russia together. So much of what British intelligence has done over the course of the last 200 years is work very, very hard to drive a wedge between Germany and Russia. Because if Germany and Russia could stand together, then the European mainland would align with them, and British domination of Europe would end, right? Britain's just an island, right? But Russia is a huge landmass. Germany is, very central. It's an industrial center, and it's in the heart of Europe. And if Russia and Germany were to stand together, that would be the end of the Atlanticist world order, right? Where the British Empire rules by dominating the trade routes, right? The British Empire, they wrote that the way to control the world was by having the biggest navy. It's actually considered the first book of geopolitics. I can't remember the name of it. Was the British Empire explaining that the way that they were going to rule the world was by having the best navy. And that was the model that the British developed for ruling, was they would control the trade routes, and anyone who wanted to trade via ocean had to go through them, and they would be the middleman. And that speculation, and being a middleman, that would be the way that these giant British corporations would make their profits. They would not develop the countries that they traded with. They would not industrialize. They would control the seas. They would control the trade routes, right? If anyone wanted to ship anything anywhere else, you had to go through the British. And that they would scrape a little bit off the top every time any trade interaction went down. That's the British or Atlanticist model of ruling, and it's actually very similar to how the Roman Empire ruled the world. The Romans ruled in the exact same way. What is the expression associated with the Roman Empire that we have often heard? All roads lead to Rome. What does that mean? That means that if you were in Tunisia or Carthage, if you were in Greece, if you were in Gaul, you could not have a road to another part of the Roman Empire. If you did, the Romans would kill you. The only roads in the ancient Roman-dominated world were roads that went to Rome. Rome was the middleman in all trade. All trade went through Rome. That's how they operated. That's very much how the British Empire operated, right? Rome did not go around building things. Rome did not go around creating things. It built some pretty nice roads and made sure that everyone who traded through them. They were the middleman, the global middleman of the world economy. And that's how they operated. And, Rome was basically a military state. Its industrial capacity, its ability to produce metal and tools, its ability to produce its own agricultural output were constantly decreasing. And so they made up for it by plundering slaves and plundering metal and from other peoples, right? This is the Roman Empire. And the struggle of the Roman Empire was basically, getting to the point that their military wasn't even strong enough. I have a whole lecture you can watch, Is America the New Rome, where I talk about this. This is the model, the Atlanticist model of dominating the world economy, right? It started with the Roman Empire, right? The Roman Empire was about dominating trade. And in fact, someone asked me here about religion. It's interesting, in the book of Revelations in the Bible, many people consider the book of Revelations to be the early Christian church writing a kind of coded manifesto against the Roman Empire. And there is actually a line in the book of Revelations where it describes the Antichrist as controlling global trade, right? That I forget the particular verse and passage, but there's when it's describing the Antichrist, the figure that people describe as the Antichrist, charges for smear, peace. I'm not familiar with that. I'm not familiar. I'm going to have to look into that. I know I'm familiar with all the individuals you mentioned, Whitney Webb, Eva Bartlett. I didn't realize what you mentioned, so I'm going to look into that for sure. I'm familiar with them, but I didn't realize that was happening. So let me check that out. But basically, that was how the Roman Empire operated, right? They didn't, you could be a king of your local region. You just had to pay tribute to the Romans, and they had a monopoly on all the trade. So it's actually very fascinating. Okay. So someone asked about Soviet computers. That is totally true. The Soviet Union, they developed home computers, personal computers. They were doing great in computers. I mean, they had great advances in computer technology. They just didn't have the budget to invest in mass producing it. Um, they just didn't have the budget to mass produce it. They didn't. They didn't have the resources, to mass produce it, and so they were at that point they were not able to really go ahead with it. But they were making great advances in terms of computer science, no doubt about it. But they and that it's important to note also that there was a NATO treaty that made it illegal for any Western country to give any computer technology or technological information to the Soviet Union. Um, so there you go. All right, decolonization. Well, I've said many times on these lives that I would be in favor of any oppressed nationality within the United States declaring autonomy. If the indigenous First Nations peoples wanted to separate from the United States and declare their own territory, I would be absolutely in favor of their right to do it. If the African American community wanted to have an independent black belt, and an autonomous black belt, I would be in favor of that. If the Chicano people wanted to have independence for Atzlan, I would be in favor of that. And that is, if you talk about decolonization, that would mean granting, territorial autonomy and independence to, oppressed nationalities within the United States. However, you have to be careful with that, right? Because if I go around saying it as a white man, it sounds like segregation. If I go up to the black people and say, "Hey, I want you all to have your own country, just a land for yourself. We'll draw a border right here in the South, and all the black people," it sounds like segregation. It doesn't sound good. Plus, black people have the right to not separate. They have the right to integrate, and I would never, and the same for the indigenous community. If the indigenous community wanted to have its own government separate from the United States, if they wanted a separate autonomy and their own I would be for it. But I would never tell a Native American person, you should have your own country. That would be up to them, right? The same with the Chicano people, right? Now, at this point, I don't think the majority, I don't know. I really don't know, but I don't think the majority of the black community would favor separation. I don't think the majority of the Chicano people would favor separation. Now, for the indigenous community, I know there are some tribes that have actually gone as far as symbolically declaring independence and just kind of been ignored by the U.S. government. But decolonization means that oppressed nationalities within U.S. borders should be granted the right to territorial autonomy. That's what it means, and I've always been in favor of that. That the United States should not remain a prison house of nations, right? If the Black Belt, if the Atzlan, the Chicano, the Sun Belt wanted independence, if the indigenous communities wanted independence, I would be in favor of them having that independence. All right, next super chat question. Marxist humanism. What is my position on Marxist humanism? Well, Marxist humanism, I mean, that's, was it Raya Daskaya or something like that? They're anti-communists. I mean, it's one of these ultra left, the Soviet Union didn't have pure workers' democracy, so therefore it was an evil Stalinist shithole, and and U.S. imperialism is spreading human rights around the world. Nah, nah, nah. Now, I've never been in for that crowd. Marxist Humanist Initiative, and there's another one. Oh, geez, what's the other one? It's News and Letters, and they just seem like anti-communist Trotskyites to me. I mean, they're just, I mean, they reject Lenin. They're for Marx, and then there's some like intellectuals that they like, some like weird Western intellectuals. They seem to be very pro-imperialist. That's what they seem to be to me. I don't really think very highly of them. I'll just be honest. Never been very impressed. Someone mentioned platypus. I think they're in that milieu. It's just, it's this academic group of people that are, they think the West is the best. They ought to join the Proud Boys. Right? The West is the best, right? The West has the most advanced system, and we should spread it around the world, and somehow that fits with Marxism. They reject Lenin on imperialism, right? They think that the Western countries are the best, and they, they reject all existing socialism as, like, they call it third world neo feudalism or something like that. Not a fan. Not a fan. Um, all right. Any other questions before we sign off here? Any other super chat questions? I'll be happy to answer them. I will be happy to answer them if you have any more super chat questions. Now is the time to say it, because if not, I'm going to go to sleep because it's been an awful rainy day. So now is the time to raise a question if you want me to address it. If not, I will be signing off here in a little bit. But don't forget about the Center for Political Innovation Conference. The link is below. It'll be this Saturday, October 17th. It's going to be amazing. Musical performers, speakers. It's going to be great. It'll be the first web conference of the Center for Political Innovation. I'm super excited about it. Um, uh, okay, mistakes of German communists in the 30s. Anything else, folks? Also, check out my new book on Kamala Harris. Um, good stuff. And check out Low Society, Modern Russia. Check out the Low Society podcast I just did. That would be great. That would be excellent. So there you go. So alrighty. So we got two more super chats here. And like I said, keep them coming. I'll answer them as long as you got them. All right, mistakes of Germany, of German communists in the 1930s. The German Communist Party in the 1930s, they were very much the party of the unemployed, and that there was a huge gap between the Communist Party and the Social Democratic Party. The Social Democratic Party was the party of industrial workers in factories, and they were becoming more and more reformist, just more and more reformist. Awful. Police who shot down striking workers and murdered communists were social democrats. They said the main enemy is on the left. They hated communists. They became more and more reformist as the decade went on. Meanwhile, the Communist Party was the party of unemployed people, right? The people that were unemployed. And, the people that were unemployed have very little to lose, and they're desperate for food. So, there were the bread riots, they were called, where the German Communist Party would lead crowds of people to go break store windows and feed themselves. And they had an armed wing called the Red Front Fighters League. And so the German Communist Party became more and more ultra-left as time went on, because they were the party of desperately poor unemployed people. There was an event in 1929, the bloody May of 1929, where there was a few days of armed violence between the communist militia and the police, and a lot of people got killed. It was very ugly, and it was in the Wedding district of Berlin. And many people felt that was pretty unnecessary. There was no chance of that turning into a communist revolution. It was kind of a staged uprising by the Communist Party of Germany to show strength. It was kind of putting the government of Germany on notice. Hey, look, we've got guns, we've got a militia, we can cause lots of chaos. And a lot of people got hurt, and did it really accomplish anything? Did it really accomplish anything? Was the question. Lois Althusser. Did it really accomplish anything? I think that 1929, the Red May of 1929, was not very good. Okay, Bolivia, pre-Bolivarian Venezuela. That's an interesting question. It wasn't really necessary, and that the events of 1929 were pretty problematic. A lot of people want to give you this talking point. It's a stupid, cliche talking point. I've heard it so many times. If only the Communist Party and the Social Democratic Party had joined together, they could have blocked Hitler. That may be factually true, but it would never have happened, because the Communist Party and the Social Democratic Party had been shooting at each other and killing each other since 1919, right? I just went over Rosa Luxemburg and all of that. So it's this thing that Trotsky said, but it would never have happened. I'm sorry, but it's one thing to disagree with somebody. It's another thing when someone, kills you. When you know people who've been killed by somebody, you're not going to vote for them. And the Social Democratic Party was so viciously anti-communist, and the Communist Party was so armed and ultra left, and they they were never going to get along. I mean, it just wasn't going to happen, right? I mean, it was not going to happen. The events of Weimar Germany, the 1920s, all the armed uprisings and stuff, it wasn't going to happen, right? The Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party were never going to vote for each other. They were never going to work together. And in some areas, there were recall referendums where both the Nazis and the communists were trying to recall the Social Democrats because they were so bad. Now, one thing that's widely alleged about the German Communist Party, I've heard this so many times, is that they had a slogan, first brown, then red, or after Hitler, our day. Now, that may have happened. I don't know if that actually happened, though. I have never found like proof that that slogan was actually used. I've heard Trotskyites allege that. I've heard Trotsky say that. I've never seen, a banner that said first brown, then red. I've never read an old communist pamphlet that talked about the German communists have this great slogan, first brown, then red. I've never heard that. Now, if they were saying first brown, then red, or after Hitler, our day, they were very, very, very naive. However, the Red Front Fighters League changed its name to the Anti-Fascist Front, right? And in the last 2 years before Hitler came to power, even though the communists were not voting for the Social Democrats, their main focus, in the streets of Weimar Germany was on fighting Nazis. So I don't buy that. The other thing is that, the anthem of the Nazi Party, the Hearst Wiesel song, was dedicated to some Nazi who was allegedly killed by communists. Like communists, the communists of Germany were in the streets fighting the Nazis. So I don't buy it. I just don't buy the idea that I mean it's the stupid cliche. If only the Social Democrats had teamed up with the Communist Party, and it's like taken as fact. It's like considered to be a historical fact. It's not that simple, number one. Number two, right, some people then take from that therefore Bernie supporters should vote for Joe Biden. Well, Joe Biden is not the Social Democratic Party of Germany, and Bernie Sanders is definitely not the Communist Party of Germany in 1932, and this is a completely different historical time period. Right? This is just like one of those things that you're just supposed to take as absolute fact when there are things are way more complicated, way more complicated than this. They were more complicated in Germany. They're more complicated today. This narrative that we get from Noam Chomsky and then plagiarized by Vosch, in 1932 there was an election in Germany, and the Communist Party and the Social Democratic Party didn't vote for each other, so Hitler won the election, which that's not true either. So therefore you have to vote for Joe Biden. That is like such a logical leap. That would be like me saying that, Julius Caesar was stabbed to death on the Ides of March. So therefore, when you play golf, you should use a 5-iron. What? You don't follow my logic? That's what I just said. Don't you understand? Julius Caesar was stabbed to death on the Ides of March in 43 BC. So therefore, if you play golf, you must use a 5-iron. Come on. Well, that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? It's not a good historical analogy, right? Another thing about that. There's one other thing I was going to say on that. What was I going to say? There was another point I was going to make about all of that, and I can't remember what it was. It slipped out of my head. There was going to make another point about that, but I can't remember what it was, so I'm not going to make that point. All right, biggest criticism of modern Russia. Well, I've only been to Russia a few times, right? And I don't want to be the ugly American. You don't want to go to someone else's country and just like, oh yes, you should change that, and what you need is a lecture on this from me. You don't want to be the ugly American, right? You don't want to do that. You don't want to do that, right? It's not a polite thing to do. However, since you asked, I will say that, in the election that I covered, in 2018 election, where I was embedded with the Communist Party, and I covered the Communist Party and their election campaign. I asked, the main plank that the Communist Party candidate for president who ran against Vladimir Putin raised, Pavel Grudinin, and it's been raised by Zhuganov, who's the leader of the Russian Communist Party, is they argue that the welfare state in Russia is clearly not big enough, right? They argue that with all the oil and gas money that Russia has, they should provide more services to their population. There should be more things like free healthcare. There should be, I mean, they have free healthcare, but there should be more free healthcare, right? Um, Dialectical and historical materialism, right? And that there should be, more. There should be more of a welfare state, and that's an argument, and that's how they said. Um, that's how they feel about things. So I mean, that was their position, but I haven't been there enough to really say. I mean, so and like I said, you don't want to like go to someone else's country and arrogantly say this is what you should change. And again, that's like a broad-minded question. I mean, for all I could say, like maybe I don't like Russian food. I could be like, well, they need to change their food and look at the American. Well, you don't do that, right? I mean, it's just it's like a weird question to ask somebody. But that was the main point raised by the communists, is they said that there should be a bigger welfare state, and maybe there's some truth in that. So there you go. Okay. Right. Louis Althusser. I'm not familiar enough with his work. He was a philosopher, a philosophical academic who was associated with the French Communist Party. The guy had very serious mental health problems. He killed his wife at one point in an episode of insanity. He was still is a widely respected academic in France. He died, but he was associated with the Communist Party. I'm glad you like my book, Janet. Yeah, I mean, I don't know enough about his philosophical views to actually answer your question. I mean, I haven't studied Althusser's work, and but you asked about him, very important French communist philosopher. Yeah. All right. Is Bolivia today like pre-Bolivarian Venezuela? Not following your analogy there. Venezuela in the 90s had total free market. I mean, it was, austerity in the 1990s. The electricity wouldn't come on. The garbage wouldn't be delivered. And there was a huge, hike in the price of public transportation, and that gave rise to this riot called the Caracazo. And right afterwards, Chavez attempted to come to power with a coup and failed. He went to prison. And then afterwards, he formed a legal political party and ran in the elections, and he eventually won in 1999. That was the 1990s. The Soviet Union had fallen. Neoliberalism was rampant all across Latin America. Bolivia now is a totally different situation. Bolivia had a very prosperous socialist government for a long time. In fact, the highest GDP growth rate in all of South America was in Bolivia, right? Of course, they never mentioned that. Venezuela, all its problems are because of socialism. Bolivia, well, they have socialism there too, but their economy is doing well, so we're not going to mention that. Then there was the coup that recently happened in the aftermath of the elections. There was a coup, and now they're getting ready for another election. And according to all the polls, the Socialist Party should win. So many people speculate there could be fraud. There's fear of what could happen because the right wing seized control of the government, and there's fear that they won't allow the socialists to win at the polls once again, and that's the fear, and that there's fear that there could be a civil war in Bolivia soon because there are different regions, and that the right wing has their armed groups that are terrorizing people. The left wing is increasingly being forced to take up arms, and but that's not pre-Bolivarian Venezuela. This is post-coup Bolivia. I mean, it's a different situation, very different situation. Different country, different situation. They've had socialism for a long time. Now they've had a neoliberal coup, and there's a pandemic, and it's doesn't exactly line up. Maybe you're saying that right-wing governments are similar. I mean, I don't know, but it doesn't exactly line up. Okay. Now the next question I got here was it was actually a pretty big one. Pretty big question: historical and dialectical materialism and how they relate to socialism. Wow. Okay. So dialectical materialism is the idea that all that exists is matter, but that matter is constantly in motion, right? That as Heraclitus said, you never step into the same river twice. That all that exists is matter, so there's no other force, and that That matter, though, is constantly changing. Never is the matter in a state of being still. There's constant change going on. A does not equal A, right? That's the famous expression of dialectical materialism. A does not equal A. A does not equal A, because there is no way this first A can be the same as this second A, because everything is constantly in a state of change. That's dialectics, right? And then that's the dialectic, is that there's constantly a change, and it's through conflict and clash that these changes come about, right? That first there's a thesis, then there's an antithesis, and they clash, and the result is a thesis that there's constantly change going on, and that change comes through the clash, the contradiction, it's called, between things that exist. So that's the dialectic. Materialism, right, is there's a debate going back to ancient Greece. There's a debate: do thoughts create reality, or does reality create thoughts? Right? Religious idealism is that all that exists is the reflection of God's idea. God said, "Let there be light," and so it was. So God's thoughts created the world. Or there's other kinds of idealism, like The Secret, where people are like, if I envision lots of money, I'll have lots of money. Or I think, there's people who say that language defines reality, right? That's a common one. I think, like, different kind of mystical and occults and, groups push this out there. That's all idealism, right? That says that thought creates reality. That's idealism, right? And there's different forms of it. But ultimately, that thought or language creates reality. Well, the contrary position, right? I think, therefore I am, right? Well, the contrary position is that reality creates thoughts. As Friedrich Engels said, thought is inseparable from matter that thinks, right? That's Friedrich Engels, right? The only reason you have thoughts is because you have this physical thing, this material thing called a brain that thinks, right? And that thoughts are a reflection of material reality, right? That's materialism. And that was the debate. In ancient Greece, you had materialism versus idealism, and then you had Hegel, who developed the concept of the dialectic. Marxism combines Hegelian dialectics with Greek materialism, classical Greek materialism, and you get the concept of dialectical materialism, and that is the philosophical basis of Marxism. Okay? Now, historical materialism, that is something different. Historical materialism is analyzing history and seeing humanity as constantly struggling to reach a higher mode of production, right? First we had hunter-gatherer civilization, then we had agricultural civilization, then we had industrial civilization, and that humanity is constantly striving to advance material conditions and get to a higher mode of production, right? That is the idea. And, right, that class struggle tends to drive forward this strive for a higher mode of production. That is historical materialism. And historical materialism argues that just as we've gotten from hunter-gatherer civilization, right? We had hunter-gatherer civilization. We got too good at it, right? We got so good at hunting animals with sticks and rocks. We got so good at paying attention to the patterns and how plants and fruits and nuts grew. We got so good at it that there was a scarcity, so we had to start growing our own food, domesticating animals. When we did that, that was a revolution. We had a new mode of production, and that new mode of production gave birth to new social relations like slavery. Eventually out of slavery and feudalism, slavery and feudalism, they weren't sustainable, and you got a higher mode of production called industrial production. First you had mercantilism, which was trade, but then you had the rise of industry, and with industry came a new mode of production called capitalism. Right? And then capitalism creates a system where there's the worker and the boss. Society divides into two great camps: the bourgeoisie, the factory owner, and the factory worker, the proletariat, those who own for a living and those who sell their labor for a living. The proletarian lives on wages, selling his labor power. The capitalist lives from profits, made from exploiting the labor of the worker, that there's a clash between the worker and the capitalist, and that eventually the worker seizes control of the government and seizes control of the means of production, establishing the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is a system in which the banks, factories, and industries are put under public control. The means of production are controlled by society. That's called socialism, or the first stage of communism. And then the idea is that eventually, the first stage of communism, which is, society controlling the means of production, gives rise to the higher stage, which is, so much material abundance existing and so much prosperity existing with a centrally planned economy that you no longer have the need for any coercion or state power, and the state itself can wither away in vast material abundance. That's the historical materialist perspective. I obviously explained how it relates to the view of the state, that's Marxism is largely based on dialectical and historical materialism. So I hope I explained that quickly for you. There you go. That's Marxism for you. So there you go. Now, folks, like I said, be sure to check out, be absolutely positively sure that you will check out our great conference we're having this weekend for the Center for Political Innovation. Link is below. Saturday, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Different voices from around the country. It'll be the first step forward for the Center for Political Innovation. Be sure to tune in. We're going to move on ahead. All my best wishes. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, the people of all countries must get prepared. Revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger of a new world war still exists, the people of all countries must get prepared. Revolution is the main trend in the world today. And don't forget, we need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. All my best wishes, everybody. Stay safe. Talk to you soon.